Hello everyone, so today we'll be talking about obedience, situational variables. This relates towards Milgram's research. So after his main procedure there then comes further variations whereby different variables are studied, and as always I'm following along with the green-haired textbook for AQA Psychology. So things you need to know and be able to recognise are what situational variables are. I recommend also knowing a few statistics for this in terms of the percentage that conform when we look at the situational variables. When we talk about situational variables, we are relating to proximity, location and uniform. And these three were further studied by Milgram after his original. And when talking about situational variables, we want to be able to compare to Milgram's original study for your AO1 marks when you are describing. So, what are situational variables? So these are factors that influence the level of obedience shown by participants and are related to external circumstances as opposed to personalities of the people involved. So it is something external. Think of situation, that's not you, that's not your own personality, that's something external. And so it's different circumstances, and by that we mean the proximity, location and uniform, which were studied by Milgram. So the first situational variable that we will look at is proximity. Now, what we mean by proximity is how close you are or what your distance is towards an authority figure who is giving an order to you. And so in terms of Milgram's study, we are looking at the closeness of the teacher and the learner. Now, in the original study, the teacher and the learner were in adjoining rooms. But when it comes to the proximity condition, they are both in the same room. And now when they're both in the same room, obedience levels drop from the baseline of 65% to 40%. A second condition is whereby the teacher, which is our real participant, they have to force the learner's hand on an electric shock plate. This is known as touch proximity, and they do this when they don't give a correct answer or give an answer. So obedience in that case drops to 30%. Another condition was whereby the experimenter has to leave the room and give instructions to the teacher, which is our real participant, via the telephone. So this is known as a remote instruction, and when this happens, the time proximity is reduced and obedience further reduces to 20.5%. And in the last proximity variation, participants, so that's the teachers, they give weaker ones than they are ordered to on the phone. So when they say give the volt of 300 volts, that shock to the learner, they potentially would have given a lower one, let's say of like 15, so like the minimal. So therefore the obedience just reduced dramatically, and in that case it was the 20.5%. Furthermore, we have location. So Milgram originally conducted his study at Yale University, which is a very prestigious university, and instead of conducting the experiment there, he then went on to do one in a rundown building. And when you're in a rundown building, it doesn't really look as professional, it's not as prestigious, and so therefore the experimenter has less authority. And when they did this, obedience fell to 47.5% compared to the original baseline of 65%. Now it still is quite high, that is the highest of the variations after the original, so that's something to think about. And finally we have uniform. So in the original study, the experimenter wears a grey lab coat, and what that does is it symbolises authority, because it looks like someone is in charge. In the uniform variation, the experimenter, however, is called away by a telephone call at the start of the procedure. And the role of the experimenter gets taken over by a member of the public in just normal clothes, so they're not in a lab coat. So it sort of reduces the idea of authority. and we find that this is the lowest obedience of all the variations that are conducted, because obedience drops to 20%. Okay, so now we've got the evaluation, which is your AO3 marks. So first we've got some research reports. So Bickman in 1974 conducts a field experiment. Remember, that is outside the lab. It's not in a strict condition necessarily. It's outside, but it's still controlled because they know they're taking part. What happens is that 3 Confederates are dressed in 3 different outfits. So one Confederate is in a jacket and tie, one is in a milkman's outfit, and one is in a security guard's outfit. So what happens is they stand in the street and they ask people that pass by, oh, could you pick up that litter for me? Or can I have a coin for the parking meter? And when the Confederates do this, the security guard, the one that is dressed as a security guard, is twice as likely to be obeyed by people that pass by than the one that is dressed in a jacket and tie. And so this does support Milgram's conclusion that wearing a uniform conveys obedience. We have this lack of internal validity, which is a limitation of these variations. So originally we had the criticism for Milgram's main study by Orr and Holland that participants had realised the shocks weren't real and they just went along with the situation anyway. But even when this extra manipulation is added on, Milgram comes along and says, actually, yeah, participants would have realised the shocks aren't real, because we can use the example of where the experimenter is replaced by a member of the public in that uniform situational variable. And so it is a limitation because we're not actually sure whether the results reflect genuine obedience or whether it is just that participants saw through the deception and therefore after they'd realised they were just going along with the situation for the sake of it. So therefore it does lack this internal validity, which is a limitation. Cross-cultural replication. So we have different things here in terms of strength, limitation, and you can turn this on its head in a Peel paragraph, because generally we have good supportive evidence for cross-cultural replications that can be replicated in other cultures and we find the same results as we do in America. Now, Miranda et al. In 1981 found an obedience rate of over 90% amongst Spanish students. That is really high. So therefore it does suggest that Milgram's results aren't limited to American males only. So it's also good in the gender terms because we can say it also applies to females because the Spanish students were both, both male and female. So it is valid across cultures. But then we've got this sort of, it's not as good as what we might think because it hasn't really been tested in non-Western cultures. And so it's kind of very premature to say that Milgram's findings apply everywhere in the world. Because what Smith and Bond say is that the replications have mainly taken place in Western developed societies such as Spain and Australia, and they are relatively similar to the USA. Furthermore, another strength is that we have a high level of control of the variables in Milgram's variations, because what Milgram did was he was only altering one variable at a time to see what effect it had on obedience. And because he was doing this, it means that every other variable was remaining the exact same as the original. So the study can be replicated and other researchers can do this in the exact same way, which is good because therefore we can say that the findings aren't just a one-off chance, and the fact that it's been tested with more than 1,000 participants in total, it's got quite a high sample number, as well as just suggesting that the phenomenon that is being studied is very robust. It's it's something that is being shown as we've got the similar findings and variables are being strongly controlled for. A limitation of situational variables is the obedience alibi. So what Mendel says is that using a situational explanation of obedience offers an alibi for those that use evil behaviour. If we say that the reason why people are evil is because they're just following orders and they're obeying them, then it takes away the idea that people have this personal responsibility. And this can be offensive towards survivors of the Holocaust, because if we say that the Nazis were simply obeying orders and they themselves are victims because the situational factors were beyond their control, it sort of argues that situational variables result in obedient behaviour, taking away that responsibility that people have. And so if we just say that, oh, well, they were just doing their duty and obeying orders, it runs this risk of trivializing genocide. So it's not very positive, and therefore it is a limitation, because it's offering an alibi in the sense that it's just saying, oh, well, they were only doing it because they were told to. Okay, so I've had a look through the papers that are available on the AQA site to you, and this AS exam question was one that I found that relates towards this. This is a 12 marker, so it would be a 6 and 6 split for AS. If you're an A level student, that changes. It would be a 4 and 8 split, so 4 AO1, 8 AO3. Now this question can trick a lot of students, because a lot of students don't always plan their answers, and I think this is where a lot slip up. So it says here, you may use this space to plan your answer. Now, some students just completely ignore it and go on, but I do strongly recommend that you do, because it is found that students who do this have a much more clear, structured answer. And it's kind of a tricky question, really, because it's not your typical outline and evaluate or discuss something. It's outline research into the effect of situational variables on obedience and discuss what this tells us about why people obey. So your evaluation needs to talk about the effects, the impact and what it has upon people of why they obey. So that's just for you to look through. It just tells you your split there and tells you how you can get into the different levels. So this is your mark scheme here. I love looking at this AO3, the bottom part. It highlights here in bold possible discussion points about what the research tells us about why people obey. So important that you make sure you are addressing the question. So that one that we were talking about, Mandel, here it says mass killing of Jews was undertaken in close proximity of the victims without protest. So just mentioning what I was talking about in terms of Mandel would be valuable here to use, because it's a real life example. It shows you have the knowledge as well. The discussion of reasons why rate of obedience changes. Now, we haven't talked about that in here, but this is this thing called social psychological explanations, such as your agentic autonomous state and legitimacy of authority, and dispositional explanations. That's like your personality, which we'll cover more in a different video. But it just shows also that the mark scheme's looking for variation in a sense. It doesn't want you to just focus necessarily on just one spread of the book. You can use things from different bits of the social influence topic as a whole. And I wanted to really point that out because it's something that students don't think they can do. At the top for your AO1, we can see this was what we were talking about. But even here it brings in the Hofflin hospital location. So think of them when they were in their hospital location. They were obeying, and you can use that as an example as well. That would get you more AO1 marks, because a lot of students think when they look at the AO1 for situational variables, well, there's not really enough information here to get 6 marks for AO1, I don't think. But looking at the mark scheme, it suggests other alternatives that you can bring in. So in this case, it talks about the Hoffman example, and even Bickman. So we use this as an AO3, but you can always turn it into an AO1 by just stating what they did and what they found, as opposed to evaluating it by calling it a strength. Okay, thank you for listening, and best of luck with all your revision.